The transmission arrived on every screen, every device, every network across human space simultaneously. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, and according to every expert who scrambled to analyze it, impossible to fake. The Vexhari Imperium, masters of 17 galaxies, conquerors of 1,000 civilizations, had finally turned their attention to humanity. Their message was brief, translated into every human language with flawless precision, delivered in a voice that resonated with the weight of countless conquered worlds. They spoke of humanity's expansion into territories they claimed as theirs. They spoke of violations, of trespasses, of the arrogance of a young species that had dared to touch the edges of their ancient dominion. They gave humanity 7 solar cycles to withdraw from all disputed systems, to dismantle all outposts beyond the Sol system, to accept tributary status under Vexhari rule. The alternative, they stated with the casual certainty of those who had never known defeat, was total annihilation. What the Vexhari did not expect, what their vast databases and their millennia of conquest had not prepared them for, was laughter. It started small, a chuckle here, a snort there, in military command centers and civilian bars across 100 worlds. Then it grew. Social networks exploded with memes, with jokes, with an almost hysterical amusement that swept through humanity like wildfire. The Galactic Council, those species who had already bent the knee to the Vexhari centuries ago, watched in horror as humanity's response was not fear, not panic, not even defiant rage, but genuine, uncontrollable laughter. The Council ambassadors sent urgent messages, pleading for humanity to understand the gravity of their situation. The Vexhari, they explained, had ended a 1,000-year peace to issue this declaration. 1,000 years without conquest, without expansion, a millennium during which they had consolidated their power and their fleets had grown beyond measure. Did humanity not understand what this meant? But humanity understood something the Galactic Council did not. Humanity understood what 1,000 years of peace did to a warrior species. They understood what happened when conquest became memory, when veterans died and were replaced by those who had only heard stories of war. They understood what happened to the sharp edge of military readiness when it had nothing to cut against for a millennium. The human military analysts pored over the Vexhari transmission, breaking down every detail of their warships visible in the background, every weapon system displayed in their intimidating montage. What they found was telling. The Vexhari still used ships whose designs were 800 years old. Their weapons were refined, certainly, perfected even, but they were the same weapons that had won their last wars. Their tactics, evident in the battle footage they so proudly displayed, were textbook maneuvers from an era when their enemies had been technologically primitive. The Vexhari had spent 1,000 years at peace, growing complacent in their superiority, while humanity had spent every single day of its existence at war. Because humanity had never known peace, not really. The century after first contact had been marked by the border conflicts, small wars with minor species over resources and territory. Then came the Crucible years, when 3 major powers emerged among the human colonies and spent decades in a Cold War that occasionally turned hot. There were the pirate suppressions, the corporate wars, the ideological struggles that saw fleets clash in the dark between stars. Even now, with the unified human government nominally in control, there were always skirmishes. Always disputes, always some group somewhere testing their new weapon designs against someone else's shields. Humanity had never stopped fighting, never stopped innovating, never stopped learning the hard lessons that only real combat could teach. Every engagement, no matter how small, fed data into vast military databases. Every loss was analyzed, every victory dissected. Human weapons designers were not artists perfecting a classical form, they were desperate inventors in a constant arms race against each other, and now, against whatever else the universe might throw at them. The Vexhari expected their declaration to bring submission or at least desperate military preparation. Instead, they received humanity's official response 3 days later. It was delivered by Admiral Sarah Chen, commander of the United Human Fleet, a woman whose career had been forged in a dozen border conflicts and who had never known a year of true peace. She stood in full dress uniform, medals earned in real blood covering her chest, and she smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was not a diplomatic smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed exactly what they wanted. She thanked the Vexhari for their message, acknowledged their impressive history, and then, with perfect professional courtesy, declined their generous offer of surrender. Humanity, she explained, would not be withdrawing from any systems. Humanity would not be accepting tributary status. Humanity would, however, be happy to accept the Vexhari's surrender when they came to their senses. The transmission ended with her saluting sharply and walking off screen, but not before the camera caught the laughter of her staff in the background. The Vexhari response was predictable in its fury and concerning in its scale. They mobilized the first conquest fleet, a force that had not been deployed in 400 years, a collection of 10,000 warships each the size of a human city. The species of the Galactic Council watched the fleet muster and sent increasingly frantic messages to humanity. They shared their own experiences of Vexhari conquest, the overwhelming force, the ruthless efficiency, the absolute certainty of defeat. Some offered to mediate, to negotiate a less harsh surrender. Others offered asylum to human refugees, places where humanity's remnants might survive after the inevitable fall. A few, those who remembered their own independence with particular bitterness, offered quiet support, hoping that perhaps this time, somehow, someone might bloody the Vexhari's nose even in defeat. But none of them expected humanity to win. Victory was not even a consideration. The best humanity could hope for was to make the cost of conquest high enough that the Vexhari might offer merciful terms. Humanity's military command had no such modest aspirations. In the 3 months it took the Vexhari fleet to cross the distance to human space, Admiral Chen and her staff worked 20-hour days planning not for survival, not for a fighting retreat, but for victory. They studied every fragment of data they had on Vexhari technology and tactics. They ran 10,000 simulations, war-gamed every possible scenario. Stress-tested every strategy until they found the weaknesses. And there were weaknesses. The Vexhari ships, for all their size and power, used predictable formations perfected over centuries. Their weapons were devastating but fired in patterns that could be anticipated. Their shields were nearly impenetrable from the front but had never been designed to handle attacks from below, because none of their previous enemies had thought to attack from that vector. Most tellingly, their communications were sophisticated but centralized, with fleet commands flowing from flagship to subordinate vessels in a hierarchy that would crumble if the right nodes were eliminated. The human fleet that assembled to meet the Vexhari was less than a quarter the size, 3,200 ships ranging from massive dreadnoughts to swift destroyers, and it looked nothing like what the Vexhari expected. There were no proud formations, no symmetrical battle lines, no display of force meant to intimidate. The human ships scattered across a volume of space 3 light-hours across, hiding in asteroid fields, lurking in the shadow of dead moons, their stealth systems refined in countless skirmishes to near perfection. When the Vexhari arrived at the contested system of Threshold, they found what appeared to be a token defense, a mere 300 human ships arranged in traditional defensive positions around the primary planet. The Vexhari commander, High Strategos Kalvex, broadcast his ultimatum one final time, offering humanity a last chance to surrender. The human commander of that token force, Captain James Morrison, responded with a single word in flawless Vexhari that translated loosely as an anatomical impossibility. The Battle of Threshold began with the Vexhari doing exactly what 800 years of tactical doctrine told them to do. They advanced in overwhelming force, their forward elements supported by overlapping fields of fire from the main fleet, a formation that had shattered 100 defensive lines across galactic history. They expected the human ships to either flee or die gloriously in a hopeless last stand. Instead, the moment the Vexhari fleet committed to their advance, space erupted with weapons fire from every direction. The 2,900 human ships that had been hiding ignited their drives and attacked simultaneously, striking from above, below, behind, vectors the Vexhari defensive doctrine had not seriously considered in centuries. Human missiles, each one guided by AI systems that had learned from thousands of combat engagements, found gaps in Vexhari shields and exploited them with ruthless precision. Human rail guns, firing projectiles at relativistic speeds, punched through armor that had never been tested against kinetic impacts of such velocity. But it was the human electronic warfare that truly shocked the Vexhari into disarray. Dozens of specialized human ships, vessels that looked harmless on sensors, unleashed sophisticated cyber attacks that had been refined in countless corporate espionage wars and nation-state conflicts. Vexhari communications channels filled with false orders, ship systems reported phantom damage, targeting computers locked onto friendly vessels. The carefully orchestrated Vexhari advance dissolved into chaos as ships lost contact with their command structure and captains were forced to make individual decisions, something they had not been trained to do, something their doctrine had not prepared them for. High Strategos Kalvex watched in disbelief as his fleet, which should have crushed the human force in minutes, instead found itself fighting 1,000 separate engagements simultaneously, each one a brutal knife fight in the dark where human ships appeared, struck, and vanished before his vessels could properly respond. The battle that was supposed to last an hour stretched into 6, then 12, then a full day of desperate fighting. When the first conquest fleet finally retreated from Threshold, it had lost 1,800 ships, nearly a fifth of its strength. The human fleet had lost 900, losses that hurt but losses that humanity had planned for and could replace. More importantly, humanity had learned. Every engagement had been recorded, every Vexhari tactic analyzed, every weakness noted and filed away for the next battle. The Vexhari, conversely, had learned only that their assumptions were wrong, but not yet why they were wrong or what to do about it. High Strategos Kalvex sent urgent reports back to the Vexhari Imperium, trying to explain how a technologically inferior force had fought his fleet to a standstill, trying to convey that these humans were unlike any enemy the Imperium had faced before. His reports were received with skepticism by the High Command, a collection of generals and admirals whose most recent combat experience was a minor rebellion 40 years ago, and who simply could not believe that a species they had never heard of could challenge Vexhari supremacy. The Galactic Council's response to the Battle of Threshold was not celebration but terror. Humanity had not simply defended itself, it had hurt the Vexhari, something no species had done in living memory. The Council knew what came next. The Vexhari would not accept such a humiliation. They would escalate, they would bring forces even more overwhelming, and they would make examples that would echo across the galaxy. The Council ambassadors again approached humanity, this time not with offers of mediation but with warnings. The first conquest fleet was merely a vanguard, they explained. The Vexhari could field 100 such fleets if they chose. They had the resources of 17 galaxies, the industrial might of 1,000 conquered civilizations. Humanity had won a battle, yes, but how could they possibly win a war of attrition against such overwhelming numbers? Admiral Chen listened to these warnings with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments before. She thanked the ambassadors for their concern and explained that humanity understood the mathematics perfectly well. Yes, the Vexhari could field more ships. Yes, they had greater resources. But wars were not won solely by counting ships and adding up industrial output. Wars were won by will, by innovation, by the side that could adapt faster and strike harder. The Vexhari had resources, certainly, but they also had 1,000 years of bureaucratic inertia, a rigid command structure that rewarded conformity over creativity, and an entire empire that had grown soft in the certainty of their own superiority. Humanity had something the Vexhari had lost, something that no amount of ships could replace. Humanity remembered how to be desperate, how to be hungry, how to look at impossible odds and laugh because the alternative was despair. The ambassadors left that meeting deeply unsettled, uncertain whether they had just witnessed courage or madness. The Vexhari's second offensive came 4 months later, this time with 3 conquest fleets totaling 30,000 ships, commanded by war leader Thraxkor, a hardened veteran recalled from retirement specifically to crush the human rebellion. Thraxkor had studied the Battle of Threshold obsessively, poring over every sensor record, every tactical report. He understood now that humanity would not fight a conventional battle, would not obligingly line up to be destroyed. He adapted Vexhari doctrine accordingly, implementing distributed command structures, training his captains to operate independently, deploying his own reconnaissance elements to hunt for hidden human forces. When his fleets arrived at the strategically vital system of Crossroads, he found no defending fleet at all, just evacuated colonies and empty space. For 3 weeks, his forces swept the system, finding nothing, growing increasingly frustrated and stretched thin as they investigated every asteroid field and moon that might hide human ships. Then the humans struck, but not at Crossroads. While Thraxcor's fleets searched an empty system, human forces attacked supply lines 3 systems away, destroying the logistics bases that the Vexhari fleets depended on. They hit construction facilities 4 systems in another direction, bombing shipyards back to pre-industrial ruin. They ambushed reinforcement convoys, isolated garrison forces, and generally made it clear that they had no intention of fighting the war the Vexhari wanted to fight. Thraxcor rushed his fleets back to defend critical infrastructure, splitting his forces to cover multiple systems, and that was when humanity sprang its trap. The human fleet, concentrated and ready, fell on the divided Vexhari forces piecemeal, destroying them in detail before they could reunite. The Battle of Crossroads, as historians would later call it, was not a single battle but a campaign of a dozen engagements spread across a month, and by its end, another 12,000 Vexhari ships had been destroyed for the loss of 3,000 human vessels. The psychological impact of Crossroads was even more devastating than the military defeat. The Vexhari had never fought an enemy that refused to defend territory, that treated planets and systems as pieces to be traded for tactical advantage rather than prizes to be held at all cost. They had never faced an enemy that seemed to care more about destroying Vexhari ships than protecting their own civilians, who had evacuated entire worlds just to set up ambushes. It was alien to them, both tactically and culturally, and it shook their confidence in ways that mere defeats could not. Worse, word of the battles began to spread through the Imperium's subject species. On worlds that had been conquered centuries ago, populations that had accepted Vexhari rule as inevitable began to whisper about the humans who laughed at threats and won battles they should have lost. Resistance movements, long dormant, began to stir. The Vexhari High Command faced a crisis of belief. For 1,000 years, their supremacy had been unquestioned, their victory in any conflict a foregone conclusion. Now, in the span of less than a year, a single upstart species had shattered that certainty. The military commanders argued for full mobilization, for bringing the full weight of the Imperium to bear and crushing humanity once and for all. The civilian leadership, however, urged caution. The wars against humanity were already straining the Imperium's economy, diverting resources from maintaining control over their vast territories, and the news of defeats was causing unrest in ways they had not anticipated. For the first time in centuries, the Vexhari were divided on strategy, and that division was itself a victory for humanity because it meant uncertainty had taken root in the heart of their empire. Meanwhile, humanity was transforming. The war had unified the squabbling factions and rival powers in ways that decades of political negotiation had failed to achieve. The corporate wars were forgotten as megacorporations turned their competitive drive toward outproducing each other in weapons and ships. The ideological disputes were set aside as entire populations threw themselves into the war effort with the fervor of a species that had finally found a cause worth fighting for. Shipyards that had been building commercial freighters were retooled to produce destroyers. Asteroid mining operations that had been concerned with profit margins now raced to extract materials for the war machine. Scientists who had been pursuing academic research found themselves designing new weapons, new defenses, new ways to kill Vexhari ships more efficiently. Humanity was doing what humanity had always done best: it was adapting, innovating, and turning conflict into an engine of progress. Admiral Chen, now promoted to Supreme Commander of Human Forces, stood in the Strategic Command Center deep within Luna's armored heart and watched the holographic display of known space. Red markers showed Vexhari-controlled systems, an overwhelming tide of crimson that made humanity's blue territories look like a tiny island in a vast ocean. But appearances were deceiving. Those red systems were not all equally secure. The Vexhari had conquered them over millennia, integrating them into an empire that was vast but also brittle, held together by the assumption of invincibility. Crack that assumption, Chen thought, and the whole structure might come tumbling down. She turned to her staff, officers who had aged years in months of constant warfare, and outlined the next phase of their strategy. They were no longer going to simply defend and counterattack. They were going to do something that would have seemed insane a year ago. They were going to invade. The operation was called Prometheus, named for the Titan who stole fire from the gods, and it was ambitious to the point of recklessness. A human fleet, 2,500 ships strong, would strike deep into Vexhari territory, bypassing fortified systems to hit a regional capital called Varthax Prime. The system was not just militarily significant, it was symbolically crucial, the seat of Vexhari power for an entire galactic arm. It was defended by orbital fortresses that had never been threatened, by garrison fleets that had grown complacent, by a civilian population that had never imagined they might be in danger. The risk was enormous. If the fleet was trapped and destroyed, humanity would lose a quarter of its military strength. But the potential reward was greater. If they could actually take Varthax Prime, even temporarily, they would prove that nowhere in the Vexhari Imperium was safe, that humanity could strike at the very heart of their empire. The fleet launched in secret, traveling through rarely used hyperspace routes, their navigation systems guided by data purchased at great cost from alien smugglers who operated in the gray spaces between civilizations. They arrived at Varthax Prime 3 weeks later, emerging from hyperspace directly into orbit of the primary planet, bypassing the system's defensive perimeter entirely. The Vexhari defenders scrambled to respond, but they had been caught completely unprepared, their ships in maintenance cycles, their weapon systems in standby mode. The human fleet struck with surgical precision, targeting not the military installations but the orbital media platforms, the communication satellites, the broadcast centers that spread Vexhari propaganda across 100 worlds. For 6 hours, humanity owned the skies above one of the Imperium's most important worlds, and they used those 6 hours to broadcast a simple message. Admiral Chen herself delivered it, speaking in Vexhari with only a slight accent, standing before cameras that were being fed to every screen in the system. She did not threaten. She did not boast. She simply explained that the Vexhari Imperium had made a mistake. They had assumed that because they were old and powerful, they were invincible. They had assumed that because they had conquered 1,000 species, all species could be conquered. They had forgotten the most important lesson of history, that empires that stop growing begin dying, that militaries that stop fighting begin rusting, that dominance unchallenged becomes fragility unnoticed. Humanity, she said, had not come to conquer Varthax Prime. They had come to remind the Vexhari of something they had forgotten. They had come to remind them what it felt like to be afraid. Then the human fleet withdrew before the Vexhari could bring their full strength to bear, jumping back into hyperspace and scattering to rendezvous points across a dozen systems, leaving behind only damaged infrastructure and a population that had learned they were not, after all, safe from the consequences of their empire's wars. The aftermath of Operation Prometheus was chaos for the Vexhari and opportunity for everyone else. Subject species across the Imperium, seeing that the invincible empire could bleed, began to rebel openly. The Vexhari found themselves fighting not one war but dozens, as suppressed populations saw humanity's example and decided that perhaps freedom was worth the risk after all. The Imperium's military, designed to project power outward, struggled to maintain internal control while simultaneously fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Vexhari resources, vast but not infinite, were stretched thinner with each passing month. The High Command argued among themselves, some advocating for negotiated peace, others demanding total mobilization for a final overwhelming assault, and their inability to achieve consensus paralyzed strategic decision-making. Humanity, meanwhile, was growing stronger. The war economy was producing ships faster than they could be crewed, forcing a rapid expansion of training programs. New weapon systems, tested in actual combat rather than simulations, were being deployed at a pace that left Vexhari intelligence scrambling to keep up. More importantly, humanity was beginning to receive unexpected support. Several of the Galactic Council species, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quietly began providing intelligence, resources, even volunteers who were tired of living under Vexhari dominance. The war was evolving from a bilateral conflict into something larger, a genuine challenge to the old galactic order. And at the center of it all was humanity, laughing, fighting, dying, and somehow winning. But Admiral Chen knew better than to believe their own propaganda. Yes, humanity was winning battles, but the Vexhari still had vast reserves of strength. One mistake, one moment of overconfidence, and everything humanity had gained could be lost. She pushed her officers relentlessly, demanding they plan for every contingency, that they never assume victory was inevitable. Because that assumption, that certainty of triumph, was exactly what had made the Vexhari vulnerable, and she would not let humanity fall into the same trap. Every victory was analyzed for mistakes. Every defeat, and there were defeats, was studied obsessively to extract lessons. Human military doctrine continued to evolve in real time, adapting to each new Vexhari countertactic, staying ahead through sheer bloody-minded determination to never stop learning, never stop improving. 18 months after the war began, the Vexhari finally achieved internal consensus on their strategy. They would commit the Grand Armada, a fleet of 150,000 ships that had not been assembled since the early days of the Imperium, a force so overwhelming that no tactics, no cleverness, no amount of human tenacity could hope to stand against it. It would take 6 months to gather and organize such a force, 6 months during which the Vexhari would pull back from minor conflicts, consolidate their territories, and prepare for the final confrontation. They sent word to humanity through neutral channels, not an ultimatum this time but a simple statement of fact. The Grand Armada was coming. When it arrived, the war would end, one way or another. They offered humanity one last chance to negotiate terms, to accept a subordinate but survivable position within the Imperium rather than face complete annihilation. Admiral Chen received the message in her command center, surrounded by her exhausted staff, looking at strategic displays that showed human forces stretched to their limits. She was silent for a long moment, and her officers waited nervously, knowing that the decision she made would determine the fate of their entire species. Finally, she laughed, that same laugh that had started this war, that laugh that had echoed across human space when the Vexhari first issued their arrogant demands. Because she realized something the Vexhari had not. They were giving humanity 6 months, 6 precious months to prepare, to build, to plan. 6 months during which Vexhari forces would be pulled back, leaving their subject species with less oppression and more opportunity to rebel. 6 months for humanity to spread the message to every enslaved population: the giants can fall, the empire can bleed, freedom is possible if you are willing to fight for it. She drafted humanity's response personally, keeping it brief, knowing it would be shared across the galaxy. Humanity, she wrote, acknowledges the coming of the Grand Armada and thanks the Vexhari for the advance notice. We will be ready. We have been preparing for this since the day you declared war, since the day you expected us to tremble and instead heard only laughter. You have given us the gift of time, and we will use it well. When your armada arrives, you will find that humanity has not been idle, and you will learn what we have known all along, that 1,000 years of peace is not a strength but a weakness, that easy victories make soft soldiers, and that the species that never stops fighting is the species that knows how to win. Come if you must. Bring your armada. Bring your certainty and your pride and your 1,000 years of dominance. We will be here, laughing still, ready to show you what war truly means. The message was sent, and across human space, across the rebel cells of subject species, across the entire galaxy that was watching this conflict with bated breath, that laugh echoed again. It was not the laugh of mockery anymore, not really. It was the laugh of a species that had found itself in the crucible of war, that had discovered its own strength in the face of impossible odds, that had looked at the greatest empire in galactic history and decided that empire was nothing more than another challenge to overcome. The Grand Armada would come, that much was certain. But so too was humanity's response. And when those two forces finally met, when the 1,000-year peace was truly shattered beyond repair, the galaxy would learn which was stronger, the weight of history or the hunger of those who refused to accept that history as destiny. The war was far from over, but in a sense, it had already been won, because humanity had proven something that could never be taken back. They had proven that they would never stop laughing, never stop fighting, never stop being human. And that, in the end, was terrifying in ways the Vexhari were only beginning to understand.